Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade and the Second Front. After its reorganization and official rebranding as the core word Assault, Makaroth and the commanders of the Second Front had both hoped that they would be able to effectively get to grips with the Chaos forces under the command of Magister Anaquinar Sec. The reality, however, had turned out quite differently, with the core word Assault struggling to really pin down the enemy and engage him in telling battles. Instead, they were fighting dozens of skirmishes on dozens of worlds, unable to land any truly telling blow against the surprisingly slippery Magister. And with the revelation of a vast trap on Anachronon Sextus, which we talked about last episode, well, there were a lot of Imperial commanders who were starting to question the wisdom of pushing forward as aggressively as Makaroth wanted them to. After all, the last time the Imperial Crusade overextended itself, it almost, as a consequence of that, got destroyed in its entirety, so the hesitation, especially in the face of Anachron Sextus, which proved that the enemy was still able to lay creative traps, shall we say. The hesitation was very much so understandable, even if Master Makaroth did not see it their way, urging the core word Assault to push forward more aggressively and to get to grips with the enemy. And one of the attempts to do so was to be a rather unusual one. You no doubt remember the world of Gereon, the planet that Gaunt had headed to infiltrate and assassinate a captured Imperial general. The reason why an infiltration effort was needed in the first place was because Gereon was considered to be pretty much an entirely useless planet. Not worthy of the effort it would take to mobilize Guard and Navy forces to invade it. But now, apparently, that had rather suddenly changed, as a massive force of the core word Assault was now redirected towards Gereon, of all places. Gaunt, now back in command of the renamed, again, Tarnith First and Only, was of course overjoyed by this news. He had promised himself that he would return to Gereon to liberate its people from chaos. He had never really thought he'd get the opportunity to do so, and yet here it was. Now, considering Gaunt's recent escapades with the Imperial Inquisition, I do suspect that he had at the very least an inkling as to why the Imperium had changed its tune so drastically. He was still a little bit puzzled as to why the Inquisition had placed so much faith in his tales of the Until and the supposedly chaos-resistive influences of the Until partisans and their special moth paste. But as they say, never look a gift horse in the mouth, and this certainly was a rather sizable gift horse as well. The Tarnith First and Only, and Colonel Commissar Gaunt in particular, had been given the mission of making contact with the Gereon resistance, presuming any of it still existed, and begin liaisoning between them and the invading Imperial Guard forces, as there were still sizable fortifications on Gereon that would take some time to reduce. Thus, any local information that might be available would no doubt prove vital. There were a total of 18 of these major objectives that were identified from orbit, the greatest of which was probably Kethadrak at Shet Magir, as it was called by the locals. This was a significant local population center surrounded by massed fortifications. It would be the toughest nut of them all to crack, and so Titans would be dropped down to breach the fortress walls. After which, the innumerable might of the Imperial Guard, supported by armor, would force their way in and begin cleansing the fortress and the subsequent city areas of Chaos opposition. It was by no stretch of the imagination going to be a bloodless conquest, but it seemed extraordinarily unlikely that the Chaos forces would mount more than a doomed rearguard resistance here. Indeed, it turned out later on, with information gained from the resistance, that the majority of Gereon's planetary leadership had already abandoned the world a few hours before the Imperials arrived. Recognizing that in the face of such a massive invasion force, they couldn't really do much. Still, the battle needed to be fought, and one of the troopers in the assault, along with a couple other of the Tarnith, was a brand new Imperial Guardsman, young trooper Darlin Creed, of the Tarnith First and Only. Darlin was one of the children that had been adopted by Tona Creed during the battle on Verghast. During the fighting in Vervunhive, Darlin was but a child. However, over the years thereafter, he had grown up into a strapping young man, and he had decided to join the Imperial Guard. To do so, he had to undergo basic training, which was a part of the services offered by the Commissariat aboard the Imperial Navy vessels in transit. And as the involvement of the Commissariat probably has already tipped you off too, these little lesson programs weren't just there to train new guardsmen, who were extraordinarily rare, of course, as there weren't that many people being, raised aboard a warfleet, obviously, but also to re-indoctrinate Imperial Guardsmen that had strayed a little bit too far from the ideals of the Guard. This was also widely simply recognized as a punishment detail, so young Trooper Creed's introduction to the Guard was going to be a pretty gosh darn rough one. But upon completing it, he knew that he would be able to rejoin the Tarnith First and Only, and fight alongside his adoptive parents, Catherine and Tona. Unfortunately, the fleet arrived at target before he could finish, therefore he couldn't rejoin his regiment, but since he was still technically a, trainee, he had to fight, and so was rolled into a auxiliary improvised regiment under the command of a commissar. You've got a better chance of surviving a penal battalion than you do service in one of these scratch companies. Young Trooper Catherine would also have the honor of joining the first wave in against the assault on major enemy fortifications. It didn't go very well. It did not go very well at all. But hey, on the bright side, Darlin got to see Titans blow shit up, so that's something. He also got to see a greater demon of Khorne up close as well, as it slaughtered its way through an entire tank division. What can I say? It's an experience. And he survived, which is more than most of his scratch company can brag about. And he got some kills too. Even survived an encounter with the Sons of Sek. This incidentally being one of the first times that the Coreward assault ran into the Sons of Sek en masse, and they quickly showed themselves to be every bit as dangerous an opponent as the Blood Pact. In fact, quite possibly even more so. The Blood Pact were an elite organization by any Chaos standard, to be sure, but it was still, at heart, a tribal warrior cult. with all of the potential weaknesses of such an organization, whereas the Sons of Sek were more along the lines of a cult of personality. They were trained not just by ex-Imperial Guard officers, but also by ex-Blood Pact officers, who were given enormous freedoms to shape the Sons of Sek in the way that would make them the most effective, shedding many of the weaknesses of the often tribal structure of the Blood Pact. Furthermore, Anaquanar Sek had gone for quality over quantity, and had made sure that only the biggest, most brutish, most violent and evil-minded men under his command were recruited into the Sons of Sek. Purely physically, therefore, they were exceptional stormtroopers, massive, heavily muscled men that had undergone punishing, brutal, and occasionally outright lethal training. And psychologically, they were still chaos-worshipping maniacs, willing and able to throw themselves against enemy positions with no concern for their own safety, yet also disciplined enough to only make such sacrifices when they were the most effective. They were a terrifying opponent, and no doubt about it. There was even a moment during a counterattack led by a greater demon that it looked like the assault upon Kehedrak at Shet Magir was in seriously deep trouble. But fortunately for the invaders, the majority of Gereon's true planetary command structure had already evacuated the planet. The forces that had been left behind were intended to slow down, demoralize, and bleed the Crusade yet further, fighting from entrenched positions they could hope relatively securely to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The Sons of Sek, too, had undoubtedly been left behind so as to combat test them in the most demanding of circumstances, and in all due likelihood, the data they gathered was quite promising. But of more immediate interest, really, than a battle whose conclusion was all but foregone, is the actions of the Tarnith first and only. They were deployed alongside some supporting forces almost 400 kilometers away from the massive battle raging around and inside of Kehethrak at Shet Magir. Their target was a small village named Canterbury. This was recognized as one of the areas in which contact with the Resistance could probably be made. It was also not particularly well defended, and the Tarnith and their allies easily overran the city in a 3-hour battle that, well, wasn't so much a battle really as a running skirmish turned into slaughter of fleeing enemies, as the enemy near exclusively consisted of local exhibitors, chaos-worshipping militia members in essence. Not the kind of force that's going to be standing up to a proper Imperial Guard regiment for any amount of time. However, this was when Gaunt began to understand that, well, whilst the liberation of Gereon was finally underway, it was probably too little, too late. To the Imperium, Gereon had been a non-strategically important planet, which simply meant that in the grand scheme of things, it would be liberated last. Chaos had made largely the same value judgment as to the importance of Gereon, but they had arrived at quite the different conclusion. Instead of ignoring it, they had picked on the planet and taken it over, assuming, correctly so, that it would be unable to mount an effective resistance. After which, its unenviable strategic position became Gereon's greatest disaster, as there was no real reason to try to hold on to the world. Chaos instead simply began plundering it of all of its resources, of every kind. Gaunt had delivered debriefings during his interrogations at Ancron Sextus, suggesting that Chaos had deployed warp monstrosities capable of creating tunnels into the warp that could be used to drain entire lakes dry, transporting their precious water resources to chaos-held worlds deep within the sanguinary system, where they could be used to irrigate vast farmland areas, which would then feed the Anarch and the Gaur's armies. They also took advantage of the world's material resources, minerals, ores, and anything else they could steal en masse. Even the planet's population was extracted in one way or another, either as labor in enormous camp designed to draw the resources from the ground of Gereon, or when they grew exhausted or too old or too young to work, they were sent into the meat workshop, skinning houses, where they were flayed and partitioned. Chaos medical technology differs significantly from that of the Imperium. In some ways, you could argue that it's far more advanced, as it is able to pair limbs to other beings. Thus, a severed arm could be used to return a blood-packed soldier who has lost his to full combat-capable status, even if that arm once originated from a farmhand on Gereon. Due to this, there was no cheering crowd in Canterbury, greeting their Imperial liberators. The scant few remnants of the population that had survived were later discovered hidden in cellars, nooks, and crannies in the city and surrounding it. A pitiful few compared to the total population of the world and even this city. It was a depressing realization for Gaunt and many of the Tarnith as well, especially those who had survived the original Gereon mission. But the Tarnith still had a job to do: establish contact with the Resistance, which they did successfully after having a quick playful encounter with a demon-possessed tank. You don't see that every day. You really do not. Presumably, the thing had been involved in some previous stage of the fighting and had gotten away from its unit, or perhaps it had been part of the earliest invasion force, damage left behind, or maybe its instincts simply made it wander off into the countryside to find prey. Alternatively, it might even have been a specific experiment, as Gereon had become a bit of an experimental weapons yard for Anaquinar Sec. The Resistance had been launching quite a few and successful terrorist attacks against the occupying forces, including assassinations of high-ranking occupation officials. Perhaps after getting sick of chasing the rebels around and inevitably giving up the moment they fled into the Until, the local weapons magisters figured, why not infuse a tank with a demon entity and throw it off into the countryside to see what it comes across. Whatever the reason for its existence, it caused Gaunt and his men a great deal of trouble, even managing to follow them into the Until and attacking Gaunt and his men after they managed to contact the Resistance. The beast was eventually destroyed after it inflicted serious damage on the Resistance cell led by Landerson, who was one of Gaunt's initial contacts during the infiltration process of Gereon. Now, Gaunt was under the impression that he was only to make contact with the Resistance, and then begin communicating back and forth between them and Imperial headquarters, eventually convincing the Resistance that this really was the Imperial liberation, and that they therefore should cooperate with the Imperial command in whatever capacity they could. Gaunt had been somewhat misled in this, as he had been assigned an additional commissar. At this point in time, the Tarnith have 4 commissars assigned to them. A ratio that most penal battalions never reach, but details. This commissar, one Farragut, was not, however, on Gaunt's side. He had been detailed to the Tarnith on the instructions of the Inquisition, who had him carry a teleportation beacon directly into the primary camp of the Resistance, where he activated it and therefore allowed the Inquisition to launch a mass surprise assault on the Resistance camp. Fortunately, as the bright flares of teleportation energy subsided, the assault was a capture operation rather than destroy. The Inquisition wanted all of the Resistance members gathered in one place, so that they could be thoroughly interrogated. It seems that Gaunt's tale of magical moth paste had intrigued the Inquisition very much so indeed, largely due to a factor that Gaunt was unaware of. After he and his men had left Gereon to rejoin the Imperium, they had brought along one member of the Resistance, a woman by the name of Sirik. She had decided, upon hearing that Gaunt and his men were to be probably executed due to having been exposed to chaos for way too long, decided to sell the Inquisition even harder on the idea of the Until providing some sort of cure to chaos. She had gone a lot further than Gaunt had in promising that this was the miracle cure that the Imperium wanted. And the Inquisition was eager to hear this, as they really did want to believe it, and there were tales that seemed to back up the rather optimistic ideas of the Until providing some sort of chaos cure. During the initial infiltration attempt, one of Gaunt's group, Mert Fagor, had been wounded in the neck. This wound had begun to fester, but not with any natural affliction. Instead, it had been infected by the heavily chaos-laden atmosphere of Gereon itself. Fagor appeared to be guaranteed dead, with nothing that could be done for him. Not by Anna Kurth, the team's brought along medic, or anybody else, everyone thought, until one of the Until shamans slathered his neck with the moth paste. This was expected to simply kill Fagor, as it was highly poisonous, but it was a last final Hail Mary that somehow worked. The poison had managed to drive out the infection. Now, mayhaps it was a fluke, mayhaps the near-death experience somehow kick-started Fagor's immune system. Perhaps it gave him the last bit of strength through pain or suffering to reject the influence of chaos. There are many potential explanations, none of which the Inquisition could actually fully explore because Mert Fagor had died in action on Anachron Sextus. The Inquisition had considered dissecting him. If they could just find the corpse, and probably would have if he had survived as well, just to make sure, but as there was no body to recover, and since this was awfully interesting, they instead decided to use the Inquisition's influence to have the Corward assault make Gereon a priority. Whether or not this would actually work out for them, well, that is a matter for much further down the lengthy, winding road of history. But as we mentioned last time, when it comes to chaos, the antithesis of all that lives, the arch enemy, the anti-life force, any potential cure, any potential weapon against chaos that does not include wielding chaos against itself, must be explored. Perhaps this miracle cure was too miraculous. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps all of it was simply just a long list of highly unlikely flukes that prove that every rule has an exception. But on the off chance, the 1 in a million chance that these moths might actually have some sort of innate resistance to chaos, it had to be explored. Even if a few 100,000 Imperial Guardsmen needed to be sacrificed to do so. Unfortunately, the Inquisition's over-eager approach to contacting the Resistance earned them very, very few friends. And, under mysterious circumstances, the partisans that had been rounded up by the Inquisition in the initial operation managed to escape captivity and move deeper into the Until, where it would be significantly more difficult for the Inquisition to track them down and capture them yet again. And this time, Gaunt did not want to find them for them. Fair enough. His trust had been somewhat abused after all. Not that the Inquisition usually cares about that, but still. The war would now move on. Gereon had been pacified and would now be liberated. Whatever remnants of Gereon still existed, that was. In all due likelihood, the planet would largely be declared lost. The population, well, they'd suffered under chaos. In all due likelihood, they were now going to suffer under the Imperium as well. Now, there are systems in place for adequately judging the nature of a population on a planet that has been under long-term chaos occupation. It's not like the Imperium simply wipes out every population centers whenever they reconquer a world. No, not by any extent of the imagination. However, the longer and the more severe the exposure, the fewer people will reach the Inquisition's criteria. In some cases, a simple large-scale survey followed by a general occupation to guarantee compliance would be enough. In the case of a world like Gereon that had been severely abused by the archenemy, a major effort to interrogate and investigate every last remaining man, woman, and child was likely to be necessary. And considering the scant material benefits of the world, well, let's just say that if the Inquisition was feeling generous, they would undergo these mass interrogations. If, however, it was feeling a little bit impatient, and like its time would be better spent elsewhere, yeah. It seems egregiously unfair that a world that had suffered as much as Gereon had would now in all due likelihood be, in a managed way, depopulated and resettled, only after a lengthy cleansing campaign, which would feature a tremendous quantity of promethium. After the planet's population had survived those horrors, you would think that they would deserve some reprieve, but such is the corrupting and the ruinous powers of chaos. Even those who have suffered from it the most are not necessarily spared its more insidious influences. In fact, often the exact opposite is the case. As even if the body remains, the mind, and more importantly so, the soul and the spirit, may not. It is the burden and the duty of the God Emperor's Inquisition to make sure that the populace can still be responsibly integrated into the rest of the Imperium and the Sabbat worlds. To not do so would undermine the entire military operation to recapture Gereon. The poor tormented world's days of pain would continue, but at least now there was some hope on the horizon, both for the people of Gereon and for the Tarnith first and only, who would, after this battle, be rotated back into the reserves for much deserved and long overdue rest and relaxation. It would also give the regiment a crucial opportunity to properly integrate the 181st first elements of the regiment, the Belladon intake. Granted, the two, Tarnith, or three more correctly, Tarnith, Verhastite, and Belladon, had already integrated fairly successfully during the battles for the Steppe cities, but a formal integration without las bolts flying around everybody's ears would no doubt be appreciated. Even more so for Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, as the location for the Tarnith's recuperation was to be Balhat, where Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's career first took proper flight when he was leading the Hirkan 8th against the forces of the then Archon Nadzibar. And there would be other reasons for Gaunt's relocation as well. Reasons that he was not yet aware of. Reasons that might very well change the course of the entire Imperial Crusade. But that will have to wait until next week. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.